get you a t-shirt. What size you wear?
Large or extra large.
I have an extra large.
Sounds great.
Okay, cool.
Okay, ready?
Yes, sir. Are you picking me up pretty well as well for the audio?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
I'll be the boom mic operator.
Double.
Put the cable between you two guys. Wait, I'm bouncing off the table.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, this is Donald Randell. I'm sitting here with Mr. Larry.
Larry Karaszewski.
Hey man, thank you for your time for this sit down. We're going to talk about the great Rudy Ray Moore.
Sounds good.
And I'm just curious, how did you get introduced to Rudy Ray Moore?
I'm a huge fan of Rudy Ray Moore. I discovered him, I would say, in the early 1980s, in the early days of VHS. There was, I think, a guy named Charles Band put out a compilation tape of Grindhouse trailers, and in it had Dolemite, The Human Tornado, Disco Godfather, and these are just like some of the greatest trailers of all time. And so I actually knew the trailers before I knew the movies, and I just thought they were the most hysterical things. And anybody who ever came over, I'd throw on the tape, and I sort of learned those trailers by heart. And then from that, that's where I got into the films and started watching the movies and learned sort of the legend of Rudy Ray Moore.
So prior to that, did you watch any of the other, what we call, black exploitation films?
I grew up on black exploitation movies. My dad worked in a factory, my mom was a waitress, and I grew up in the Midwest, and my dad would give me one night a week, and he sort of didn't know what to do with the kids, so he would take me to the drive-in or to the Grindhouse, and he would take like a 6-pack of beer and he'd fall asleep, and I saw every single black exploitation movie that came out. For some reason, I actually did not see the Dolemite movies, and oddly enough, I actually think Rudy Ray's movies are almost better today than they were back then. And, there's certainly, when people think of the black exploitation movies, they think of stuff like Shaft and Superfly, but those films haven't particularly aged that well. Where Dolemite and Human Tornado are actually, I think, even better today than they were back then.
My question to you is, why do you think Rudy was a little bit lower than the radar than the other guys back in the day?
Well, I think the films, the films were very low budget and sort of amateurish. But what raised them above everything else is sort of the sheer force of personality that Rudy Ray Moore has, that sort of bravado and X-rated raunch. That there's the fact that Shaft is actually well photographed and shot and has a great score, it just makes it duller. You know what I mean? There's actually, it's a professional movie, but it's sort of playing by other people's rules, where Rudy played by nobody's rules, and I think the movies are better for it.
You know what, that makes sense, because I was always curious, because people kind of like, I know Shaft, Superfly, and Mac and all that, but for some reason, as you know, the rappers, like Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, all those guys, adapted Rudy, Big Daddy King, and it's like, you don't hear them talking about those. They sample Rudy Ray Moore,
yeah.
From the Chronic album, the Two Live Crew, and all these guys,
Well, there's, Rudy is more street. Rudy feels real. Not to knock Richard Roundtree, who's an excellent actor, people like that, but Rudy feels like, a guy from your street. He feels like, a guy you could relate to. And the movies feel like they were shot that way too. And one of the great things about those films are they really feel like they're 2 or 3 guys with a camera, in the parking lot of the Ralph supermarket. They're clearly shooting without, permits or anything like that, and they're just making the movie the way I make movies as a student or as a kid. They're really just out there. They've got an idea for a movie, they want to do it, and it even goes into the fight scenes that Rudy Ray has. They're not professionally choreographed like a great fight scene is, but they're so funny and they're so good. It's not like he could really even do kung fu, but he wanted to be a kung fu star. So that is why I think Rudy affects people. People take him to heart more than some of those other films, because you get emotionally involved with Rudy because you feel like there's almost a non-pro thing. My writing partner and I wrote a film called Ed Wood, which is about a sort of an amateurish filmmaker from the 1950s who made movies like Plan 9 from Outer Space and Bride the Monster. And there's a similar thing in that you know, these movies were not well accepted during the day. These were certainly not famous movies at the time. But, you know, as time has gone by, you know, people who are science fiction fans or horror fans have sort of taken these movies to heart because they identify with Ed Wood. They identify with that sort of like that scrappy personality, just wants to put on a show and make a movie. And I sort of see Rudy Ray as a little bit of black Ed Wood, where he was sort of he wanted to be a movie star so bad. The fact that he didn't have a budget, the fact that he didn't have a professional crew, that never stopped him. Right. He was going to be a star through sheer force of personality. You know, that's the great thing about Rudy. Rudy carried himself as if he was the biggest star of all time.
Yes, he did. You got that right. And the thing of this in filmmaking, you know, I noticed that some people love Rudy because of who he is. They like the stand-up, the craziness, the foolishness. Then when it comes actually to the way like you mentioned, the films were shot, that there's a boom. And Dolemite, see, people kind of like laugh at that, but they love it. Mm-hmm. So,
well, strange enough, you know, one thing you really got to, you know, people sometimes think that the movies they're laughing at the movies, but they're not laughing at the movies. These movies are comedies to begin with. So, you know, I think Rudy was in on the joke, and so often larger budgets are an enemy of comedy. Because something is well shot, or because they have a lot of money to spend on a movie, doesn't necessarily mean the jokes are going to be any better. So sometimes the scrappiness of just guys filming themselves is actually funnier than professional things. You see this on YouTube a lot of times too. There's, you know, guys filming some stupid little thing on YouTube is 10 times funnier than some comedy that, you know, Warner Brothers puts out. That you know, people are trying to be funny.
You know, that's a good point. I never thought about that way because I've talked to many people over the years about Rudy's film, but I think you laid it out and explained it better than anybody ever did because we know that like people like Eddie Murphy have his Rudy Ray Moore marathon, like yourself, and I've been hearing this over the years. In college, that's like the number one thing. If I got a penny every time I heard, I used to watch Rudy Ray Moore movies marathon on Friday nights when I was in college. Off that penny, I would be wealthy. and